This will be a two-part series about Brit Milah, about the mitzvah of circumcision, and how it appears in different passages in the Torah, and what we can learn about what the mitzvah means, and also what else it tells us about some other central narratives in the Torah that contain the idea of Brit Milah. So I think in the second part of this series, there's a specific passage that is the most enigmatic and most mysterious one in the Torah that involves Brit Milah that I think we can get into in more detail, because it will take a fair bit of work to line everything up. But for now, I want to start by talking in generalities, and then we can get into some specific parts of the text that I think support some of these generalities. So what got me thinking about this was the perspective of parents in the present day who are raising children in Torah, and sometimes they have sons and sometimes they have daughters. And it sometimes feels a little bit like it must be unfair to daughters that whereas when a boy is born, there's a Brit Milah, there's a circumcision on the 8th day, and that's a cause for great celebration, that although, of course, you can celebrate the arrival of the daughter as well, there's no structured mitzvah that builds that into a part of the set of the obligations of the family and the community. And it kind of raises this question, like, what, are we not happy about having daughters? And it seems, I think, to the eye of a person living in this era, it's tempting to view it as an example of how, back then, a long time ago, societies were patriarchal and therefore misogynistic, and therefore they didn't sufficiently value daughters. And that, is the sum total of the explanation for this difference. Now, that kind of explanation never really is the explanation in the case of Torah, but it is something that you can look around other cultures of the world, and especially ancient cultures, and kind of make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, that's just how it works. Because if you look elsewhere than Judaic culture and elsewhere than Torah, you do find that there are old and ancient cultures and civilizations that definitely emphasize the greater value of having a son over having a daughter, and didn't apologize about it. And even perhaps in the present day are pretty emphatic about it. And it might be that in those examples, there isn't a better explanation, in a sense, than those were patriarchal traditions that became entrenched, and everyone is simply taught that men have greater value than women in some way, and no one really questions it or asks if it has any basis. But I don't think that just because of the existence of those cultures, that it's fair to paint the civilization of Torah with the same brush. It's true that there is a difference between male children and female children that the mitzvah Brit Milah delineates, but that doesn't necessarily mean that on top of that you assign greater value to one kind of child than the other. And I think what's more interesting is to say, okay, if it's the case that we're not going to make this kind of pat explanation of, oh, people a long time ago everywhere were misogynistic, and instead we're going to say, no, if the Torah is given by Hashem and it's for all time, and at the same time we also know other things from Torah. Like we know that Hashem made both men and women b'tzalmo, in his image, and that there is a radical sense of equivalence in that sense, in value between men and women, that we get from the very beginning of Sefer Bereshit. So that if it's not the case that the Torah sees difference in value between men and women, but merely recognizes difference in characteristics, and if that's how we have to view it, then in that case, what we need to do is come up with an alternative explanation for the not accidental difference between male and female children that plays out in the simcha of the Brit Milah. Obviously, the mitzvah of the Brit Milah itself is about the performance of an action that only makes sense in the context of a male child because of the difference in anatomy between male and female children. So you don't need to explain why there would be a Brit Milah in that sense, only for men and not for women. Though obviously some perverse cultures around the world figure out some way of doing something like a Brit Milah to women, and it's terrible. But the mechanism in that sense, the reason for it, you don't need an explanation for. But in another sense, again, from the perspective of Torah, you have to say, no, but Hashem created the world. So he made the world in this way, where there needs to be a Brit Milah for men and not for women, and that there's going to therefore be a correlative kind of simcha in Torah that attaches to the Brit Milah, and that's associated with having a son. And so all of this is to ask the question, is there some way of viewing through the lens of Torah the simcha that you have about having a son as being somewhat more legitimate, and not just, oh yeah, people a long time ago, they liked sons more and they were sort of prejudiced or biased in some way that one can now criticize, which is, a hard subject. But I think that the way through Torah to begin to understand it is to say, well, what are other things that were true a long time ago back then? When you go back in time to the generation to which the Torah was given, you are confronted by the human condition in much more raw form. And that means the physical difference in strength between men and women was much more substantial in how it dictated interactions between men and women. Women were much more vulnerable to violence and rape and kidnapping and everything of that sort, by strangers or sometimes by family members. There was less rule of law, and there was more of a need for individuals to manage their own security, which meant women needed to have men who protected them, because if they didn't, then there would be men who would prey on them. And that's the world into which a child was born, either a male child or a female child. So now you look at the position of a parent, let's say even the position of a father, since the mitzvah the mitzvah Brit Milah is a mitzvah for the father to have his son circumcised. And you say, okay, you have a son versus you have a daughter. And let's assume that you're an archetypal Judaic parent, which is to say you see equal divine spark in either a male or female child, and you see value and worthiness of deep love either in a male or a female child, which has always been the case since the inception of the Judaic idea. And if that's the case, right, you're looking through the eyes, so to speak, of Yaakov Avinu, and you say, okay, why would he be happier about having a son or a daughter? Not happier about it, but let's say, why would it be easier somehow to celebrate having a son than having a daughter? And I think, interestingly, in the case of Yaakov, the answer is shown to us in narrative, right? Because what happens to Yaakov's one daughter? Yaakov's daughter, Dinah, is kidnapped and raped, right? And what that shows to you is that when you're having a child in that world, which again, I don't want to talk about it just as a world that was then and has nothing to do with now, it's the world that reveals to us the unchangeable foundation of the human condition, that it's easy to bury in the present era under layer upon layer of human civilization, but that we should not forget, that we would forget at our peril, right? So when you view the difference between having a son and a daughter through the lens of thinking about the raw fundamentals of the human condition, and you assume that as a parent, you're going to love those children deeply and want to protect them and find what's best for them in the world and help them flourish and grow, what are your chances of succeeding at that in the case of having a son versus having a daughter, right? When you have a son, obviously also you need to nurture him and protect him, and bad things can happen to him. But you at least can have some confidence that he'll reach a certain age, and then the challenge will be finding a woman that's good for him, to help him to get married and have a family, helping him to have a livelihood. These things that are not so much about protecting him from horrible calamity, but more like making arrangements for him in the various kind of markets that he'll participate in, right? He needs to get married. He needs to have a trade or whatever. Everyone has to deal with those difficulties. When you go over and you look at the condition of the woman, again, in the human condition fundamentals, women much more frequently, a long time ago, died in childbirth. Women were much more frequently the victims of sexual violence. Women could much more easily be physically overpowered and therefore were vulnerable targets for violent crime, even that had nothing to do necessarily with sexuality, but might still be about robbery or murder or anything else. So as a parent who loves his child, as a parent who wants what's best for his child, having a daughter must have been much more terrifying, right? Less so perhaps today, but people maybe still might feel that sentiment to some degree. The greater trepidation and thinking about, what are the odds that I'm going to find a situation for this daughter where I won't ultimately feel like she's taken advantage of in some way or made a victim of violence in some way, whether it's because you're worried that instead of being married that she's going to be attacked, or even if she's attacked, you could marry her off to someone who ultimately, it turns out, physically abuses her, let's say, right? Those are all concerns that have existed since time immemorial. Some of them remain today, but that gap must have been ever so much larger in the era of, let's say, of Yaakov Avinu, and the Torah shows us that, not just with Dinah, where it's most explicit, but also, for example, with Sarah and Rivka, that just from traveling around, Avram twice has his wife kidnapped by a powerful man, by a king, and Yitzchak Avinu almost has his wife kidnapped by Abimelech, a powerful king when he's in Gerar. And so this is actually a repeated theme. In fact, it's one of the most basic and early and fundamental themes of the Torah, although we don't always necessarily recognize it as such. So the pasuk I'm thinking of course, is in Sefer Bereshit, where it's talking about this curious phenomenon of the Bnei Elohim. It says, "Hanefilim hayu ba'aretz bayamim hahem, v'gam acharei chen asher yavo Bnei Elohim el benot ha'adam, v'yoldu lahem hema, hagiborim asher me'onam anshe Hashem. וירא אדוני כי רבה רעת האדם בארץ, וכל יצר מחשבות ליבו רק רעה כל היום." Okay, so there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, or fallen in the earth in those days, and also after that, when it says Bnei Elohim, which I'll say the sons of the powerful is the appropriate translation here, came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, and the same became the mighty men of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this theme of sometimes there are powerful men and they're going to take advantage of and grab for themselves whatever women they want, this is building on top of what we're already getting at, but it's becoming intensified. What we were saying before is just that every woman is vulnerable to some kind of depredation by men who might be more physically powerful and more predatory. And that is maybe a reason, just to finish that thought, that there might be more natural simcha at having a son because it's just easier to rejoice that you've brought that responsibility for you as a parent into the world because it's less frightening. It's fundamentally much more frightening to bring a daughter into the world whom you're going to love and whom you're going to want the best for because of how slim the chances are of really getting something for her that doesn't end up making her look like somehow a victim of violence, especially, when you go far enough back in time. But now we intensify that because this thing with Bnei Elohim, it's not just saying men are stronger than women, it's saying there will be strong men. There will be men who are stronger than other men, and they will take for themselves whatever women they like. And when you read that part of the Torah that way, you realize this is one of the most repeated themes in the entirety of Tanakh, right? It's not just about this strange event that's referred to around the time of the flood of Noach, and it's not even just about Avram and Sarai going to Egypt and Paro taking Sarai, or Avraham and Sarah going to Gerar and Abimelech taking Sarah, or Yitzchak and Rivka going to Gerar and Abimelech almost taking Rivka, or Yaakov and his family dwelling near Shechem and Prince Shechem taking Dinah and raping her and trying to keep her for himself. All of those things, fit that same theme. But then it just keeps on going because if you go all the way through to Megillat Esther, for example, right? Achashverosh has his harem and he has Vashti and he gets rid of Vashti and he takes Esther. And it's all about how the king has all this power and he uses that power to make whatever arrangements he wants for having all the beautiful women in the land brought to him so that they can become his. So this is really a very frequently repeated theme, and so much so that I think we have to face it really is considered by the Torah to be a basic part of the human condition. And you don't get rid of it. You see different variations on it. In the present day, maybe it's less with coercive threat of violence that, let's say, men take many women for themselves in the United States, for example. But that doesn't mean that it's not the case. Rather, that does not mean that it isn't the case that there are powerful men who work their way through long lists of women over time because they can, because they have a lot of wealth, because they have a lot of other kinds of power, and that makes it possible for them to do that. So it's a theme that we see in various forms that repeats itself. But now let's tie that back to Brit Milah, because it's actually not so coincidental, I think, that in the story in the Torah itself that most sharply underlines this phenomenon of, let's say, the powerful men taking women for themselves as they choose. The story that most sharply underlines that is the story of Dinah. And in the story of Dinah, interestingly, how do her brothers ultimately get revenge on the city of Shechem for the kidnapping and rape of Dinah? It's interesting. They convince the city of Shechem to circumcise themselves. And then after that city performs Brit Milah on themselves, they make themselves vulnerable, and Shimon and Levi sweep through and kill everyone. And at the time, it just seems like, oh, that's just sort of a trick of the story. It so happens that they got them to do Brit Milah. They could have gotten them to do something else. It's their sort of Trojan horse maneuver in order to sack the city. But I don't think it's coincidental. I think that Brit Milah is very intricately connected to this theme, this whole question of Bnei Elohim and Benot Adam, the sort of sons of the powerful and the daughters of man. And that, in a sense, may be part of how the Torah starts to teach us about, well, what is Brit Milah really about? Why do that? What is valuable about this Brit, this Ot Brit, actually? Because the Brit is really a covenant, an agreement between Avraham and his seed on the one hand, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the other. But the circumcision is an Ot Brit. It is the sign of the covenant. So why that sign? Why should it matter? Why wouldn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu say, snip off one of your earlobes, and that can be a sign that you've heard the voice of God, or whatever it is? And, for those who say, well, that sounds monstrous or something, the Torah has other circumstances in which it does recommend punching a hole in someone's ear as a sign of something. The Eved Ivri who doesn't want to go free. So there's definitely room for that kind of a maneuver. But so if it's not what we do, and instead the Brit Milah has to do with the reproductive organ of the male, why would it have to do with that? Why is that important? And I think the basic point would be this, right? That whether you view this biologically and you think in sort of forensic or paleontological terms, or whether you view it more as signage of unchangeable aspects of human nature that are sort of baked into the created human being, however the human being came into existence, that if you look at what men are, but I think it's easiest to explain if you think of it in sort of the pseudo-paleontological just so story. Every male who exists is descended from hundreds or thousands of generations of warlord rapists, right? Because as you go further and further back in time, there's no laws, there's no widely distributed standards of morality necessarily, and human beings are closer to being some kind of animal that's just pretty clever. And in such a world, who propagates his traits genetically, right? Who reproduces himself many times? It's a male that amasses enough power to himself that he can acquire for himself many female mates. And we know of relatively recent historical examples of this, right? It's thought that something like 1 in 6 people in Asia are descendants of Genghis Khan, because Genghis Khan conquered the continent of Asia and then used the power that he gained from that to operate a very large harem. And when you do that as a mighty conqueror, you have the capacity to produce a lot of offspring. And then your genes stick around and they get transmitted, and they dominate the characteristics of your descendants, and your descendants are numerous. And look, before too long, down through the generations, the traits that produce the personalities that were willing to rape and conquer and amass large harems, that turns out to be something that is a sort of built-in capacity, maybe not of all men, but certainly of some kind of plurality of men, or some sort of archetypal set of tendencies that men might have. Some of them will be very dark and disturbing ones, right? Insofar as you're inheriting inclinations that produce traits that now are in you, but that came from many generations of what we would now view as bad behavior that shouldn't be repeated. So if we view it in those terms, we'd say, okay, so if it's the case that every male basically is the genetic and therefore behavioral inheritor of 1,000 generations of Genghis Khans, who spread their seed through violence and conquest and mass accumulation of large harems, if that is a thing we have to worry about in the standard psychology or standard biology. Not that every man will do this, but that there are aspects of male archetypal tendencies and behavior that parallel the kind of psychology of someone like Genghis Khan. Then do we just give up and say, oh, well, then what's even the point of trying to ask men to be moral? That there's too much Darwinian selection pulling in the other direction, right? Men aren't going to be moral because the immoral men are the ones who are going to eventually propagate themselves and their traits the most. And it's a hopeless battle. It's a losing battle. So that is what brings us to Brit Milah as a question of how things could be different. Because ultimately, what is the point with Brit Milah? The point with Brit Milah is that it's an agreement, it's a covenant between Avraham and HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is about the eventual success of Avram's legacy, both his biological legacy, his seed, but also what he has to offer the world in knowledge of Hashem and of justice and of righteousness. And I think the point is this, right? That you could have started by saying, all right, let's think about Darwinian selection a little bit. It seems like you're just selecting for male behavior that makes you act like Genghis Khan. That everyone else can be try to be nice, and it's really nice that they're trying to be nice, but at the end of the day, they'll have 3, 5 children. Maybe they'll have 7 children. They won't have 250 children, but if you're Genghis Khan, you'll have 250 children, and then your son Kublai Khan or whoever else Khan is going to have 250 children, and so will all of his 249 brothers. I mean, it doesn't actually quite work that way, but you start to make the simple argument and say, how can decent human beings compete with the Genghis Khan way of operating? And if the answer is they can't, then seems like it's game over. There's no point in trying to be Avraham. But that is the whole question, right? Like, Kadosh Baruch Hu is trying to create a nation that will have the proper relationship with him. And if Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to try to do something, then he's going to succeed at doing it. But it's so interesting that he has to show how almost impossible that is. That Avram and Sarah could almost not even reproduce one child, right? Because there was something almost sterile about the idea of bringing into being a nation that is so concerned with righteousness and not enough concerned with conquest and mass reproduction through rape and the fire and the sword and all of that, right? That every nation to some degree that propagated itself throughout history perhaps was driven by a certain amount of that Genghis Khan way of operating. And for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to say, let's try to create a nation that is just opposed to that completely and that doesn't act that way. Well, it turns out, you need a miracle in order to even get one child out of that kind of a union. There's something symbolic and indicative that is meant to come from the fact that Sarah and Avram barely can have one child together. And not only that, it's interesting, although it's the case that the Torah says that Sarah was akara, that she was barren, there isn't actually any success that Avram and Sarah have in conceiving and bearing a child together until Avram performs Brit Milah on himself. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't really matter. It's going to be a nes or a wonder or whatever, a miracle from Hashem anyway. So why should we be thinking as though it's some kind of biological mechanism? But it is interesting because there are other elements of surrounding stories that maybe call our attention more to that issue. So what am I talking about? Well, let's do some detective work in some sense. Avram, at the end of Parashat Lech Lecha, performs Brit Milah on himself. And then we have the beginning of Parashat Vayera, where the three visitors come to his tent, and the Torah doesn't say that he's sitting in the pain of his Brit Milah, but that's what Rashi comments in an interesting way, where he says, oh, it was, because of his Brit Milah, he was unwell, and yet we see him leap up. And so we learn this, we learn various things in the sages' commentaries in this. First of all, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came to speak to him then. We learn Bikur Cholim from that you go and visit the sick. So Avram was kind of unwell because he'd performed Brit Milah on himself. And so Hashem went to visit him because he was a chole, so to speak. But also that Avram is willing to, even in his pain, leap up and tend to his guests, and how important Hachanasat Orchim is. So you get a lot of different things out of it. And because of that, you don't really ask much more about why Rashi says this. But really, and to be fair, also, it comes right after Brit Milah in the Torah. So it's commonsensical at some level. But there is something a little bit precise about, and he was in pain. It was the third day, which is a painful day. But then you say, where do we actually get that, right? Where do we get that from? That actually is from Shimon and Levi in Shechem, right? That when they were sacking Shechem, they waited till the third day when everyone was in pain from their Brit Milah, and that's when they went and sacked the city. And it says that explicitly in the Torah at the time of Shimon and Levi attacking Shechem. So why is that important? That's important because what it does is it connects Avram and Sarah's ability to produce Yitzchak to both simultaneously Brit Milah and also the story of Dinah. And that forces you to notice that actually those themes are bookends for the event where the visitors come and tell Avram and Sarah that Yitzchak is going to be born. That before that, Avram performs Brit Milah on himself. After that, not immediately after, because we have to have the episode in stone first, but after that, we have the story with Avram and Sarah going to Gerar and Abimelech taking Sarah. And that's where we get this dose of, the son of the king. Abimelech means father king, like maybe my father is king, like he's the prince. And so it really is just like Shechem, who's the prince of Shechem. Abimelech is maybe the king of Gerar, maybe he's the prince of Gerar, whatever. But he's a royal who's taking Sarah for himself. And what's so interesting there is that we're told also that Abimelech had a whole harem that was barren, and that Avram prayed for them, at the end of the story when he's being set free and they've reconciled, that he prays for the healing of the whole harem of Abimelech. And that is kind of a funny detail, because if you have a king where his whole harem is barren, it's a little suspicious, right? Because there's one explanatory factor there that wouldn't require the simultaneous barrenness of a whole bunch of women to co-occur, which is that actually the problem is somehow with the male side of the equation, right? That Abimelech was unable to sire children with his harem, and that may have really been the problem. That's especially interesting vis-a-vis Brit Milah, because there's something also that's out of whack about where the story with Abimelech appears, right? It's after the visitors come and talk about how Yitzchak will be born. It's after Avram performs Brit Milah on himself. And there are various details in those stories that really peg things in certain ways, like that Sarah laughs because she no longer has the ability seemingly to produce children. It says that basically she's menopausal, that she no longer has the biological ability seemingly to produce a child. And then afterwards, we go to the story with Abimelech and Avram, and if you think a little bit about it, it doesn't make sense one way or the other. Why? Because if Sarah is already a 90-year-old woman and menopausal, the idea that she would be kidnapped into Abimelech's harem the instant she walks into Gerar is kind of preposterous. Like, why would Abimelech take her in that case? He is so hungry for other women to add to his barren harem that he will take any woman, even an old woman who's clearly incapable of reproducing, into his harem. Like, it wouldn't make sense if Sarah looks old, and if she is biologically old, which it seems like she must be if this is happening after the visitors come to the tent of Abraham. And on the other hand, if you say, oh, no, you're not familiar with the relevant Midrashim. Sarah and Avram were renewed and rejuvenated, and Sarah still looked like she was a 20-year-old beautiful woman at the time that she was 100 years old, right? Well, fine. We have Midrashim that say that and others that say other things, but let's take that as a explanatory premise. If Sarah looks like she's a beautiful 20-year-old woman, even though she's 100 years old, or whatever it is, then why would she then laugh as though it's ridiculous that she could ever have a child, right? Like, if you already know there's something miraculous about your biology, then for someone to come along and say, oh, yeah, you know what, I think even though you're 90 years old or whatever, that's true. But what's also true is you look like you're 20 years old. And so maybe you're actually more capable of producing a child than a normal 90-year-old. That would be a very plausible argument, right? That would seem to carry the day. But the fact that Sarah instead, when the visitors are coming, is saying, oh no, how could that be? That suggests she really is old in a way that everyone appreciates at the time. And maybe not, maybe the way the Torah is counting years, we can raise various questions about, because there are other pins in the same storyline that we have to deal with, such as, okay, when Avram and Sarah first come to Canaan, they already are pretty elderly if we're counting years, like, oh, you're over 70, you're not a spring chicken. But there it says explicitly that when they go down to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, after coming to Canaan, that Sarah was very beautiful, and she was taken, therefore, by Paro because of her renowned beauty. And so that already poses the question again of, oh, so she's beautiful, but she's also in her 70s. In that story, the beauty is mentioned explicitly. And so I think there, at least, you could say, well, that you probably have to start pointing out that in general there's just something untrustworthy at a biological level about the numbers the Torah is giving for ages, right? That Avram and Sarah come after a litany of different genealogies with different people in Sefer Bereshit who live numbers of years that are in no way consonant with the numbers of years that we count for our lives. And so at that point, we have to say either that the Torah is saying, look, whatever laws of biology you think there are, they weren't the same back then. And so that's just a premise of the narrative that you have to deal with and incorporate. I think if you go that route, though, then it becomes, you're standing on less solid ground in trying to underline the wonders that Hashem works. Like, why is it such a wonder that Sarah can have a child at 90 if there are people who live 600 years in the world, right? If that happened, then you start to say, oh, we're already talking about people who aren't really living in the natural world we inhabit. And so what's normal or not normal in that world is kind of hard for us to guess, and then we get less out of the text. So I think that it's preferable in terms of understanding more about what the text might be referring to say, no, let's assume as much as possible that these are people living in the same human condition that we live in. And if that's the case, then a variety of numbers that the Torah gives us about like exactly what it means to live for 365 shanim, um, uh, which is 365 years would be translated as, which I think that is Chanoch, not the son of Kahn, but the other Chanoch, the one that Hashem took, which is already interesting, right? 365 years, but the number 365 is kind of interesting vis-a-vis years, right? Because it's actually kind of sounding like days. It's playing with this idea of, do you really know the units of time that I'm talking in here? The narrator of the Torah is sort of saying. And so all of these measures of years and what shanim actually means, I think a reasonable way of going here is to say these numbers are there to mean other things that they have to mean. And we don't necessarily always get it to make the most sense by attributing biological age to these numbers in a clear way. And if that's the case, then you can explain Sarai being kidnapped by Paro because she was very beautiful by saying Sarai was still a young and beautiful woman when they went to Mitzrayim. Even if we somehow can prove by number counting that she must have been a 60-year-old woman or whatever it is. That instead we just say, no, in terms of her biological age, she was still a young, beautiful woman. And that is partly what Chazal must mean when they say, well, when she was 20, it was like she was 7. And when she was 100, it was like she was 20. There's this comment they make on the number of years of her life. So if we don't have to trust the exact numbers at some level as reflections of biological age, then we can explain why Paro maybe thought that Sarai was beautiful when they went to Mitzrayim. But then why would Abimelech take Sarah later? Because at that point, if it's chronological with the rest of the Torah, this is after we already are told she's a menopausal old woman who's laughing at the idea that she could ever have a child. So that woman goes to Gerar, and then Abimelech kidnaps her to put her in his harem. What does he want her in his harem for? Unless that story is not actually chronological, right? Sometimes the Torah does this. It tells us about things in out of order because it has a different point to make. It wants to put the story of Abimelech right before, and Hashem remembered Sarah, right? He accounted her and then gave her Yitzchak. It wants to put the story right before Yitzchak because there's something about what happens in that story that's connected with how they get Yitzchak, right? And I would argue that the thing about that story is its connection to Brit Milah and to what Avram has to do, right? That the two lessons that Avram learns coming out of this whole experience with Abimelech is, first of all, that it can actually be the man's fault that a woman is not able to conceive, because otherwise Abimelech wouldn't have a whole harem of barren women, right? First of all. And second of all, that there is a, let's say, a need to deal with making oneself different than Genghis Khan, right? That if Avram truly disapproves of how Abimelech or Paro would behave towards his wife, then he had better not take the same view of what he is trying to do. And I think the point with Brit Milah is realizing how to do that, and that actually was kind of difficult, even for Avram, because it's not that Avram wanted to be Genghis Khan, but he did have this idea of, okay, I'm with Hashem, and Hashem is with me, and he's going to make my seed numerous and great. I'm going to become many nations, and that's a promise. But the question is how to make that promise different than I promise to make you Genghis Khan, right? If it's not that you're going to just produce as many copies of your genes as possible, then what is the nature of this promise? And we see that in different versions. There's these different metaphors that Kadosh Baruch Hu uses to describe how the seed of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov will be. Sometimes it's, Kochvei Hashamayim, the stars in the heavens, which are very numerous, but they aren't just numerous, they're also very fixed and very slowly changing. They're very, let's say, they're the watch by which the world sets its clock, or they're the time is told by the heavenly bodies. And so there's this sense in which the idea of the stars is like, this is the fundamental reality of how the world works, and it's like your children will be the backbone. They will be the sort of atoms of the laws of social physics that govern all of human affairs. And that is one thing that was promised to Avram that becomes true in the chosen nation that comes from him. That, in a sense, like the sort of the yardstick of morality that ultimately humankind is held to, it becomes possible to articulate that clearly through the Torah that's given to Am Yisrael. But then there's also the Chol Asher Sfat Hayam, the sand that's at the shores of the sea, which is interesting because sand grains are also numerous. What's also true about the seashore is that any given sand grain is always kind of falling into the sea or getting washed back up. And so it's very dynamic, but the shore is always there. The shore never disappears, right? Because there's this kind of balance that is achieved, even though it's very dynamic. And that, I think, maybe represents the eternity of Am Yisrael, that Am Yisrael is, individuals come and go, but Am Yisrael as a whole is like the seashore, that it's dynamic, but it's somehow always there. And then there's also, I think, maybe to Yaakov, a promise made of being like the dust of the earth, which is more like being very productive. The dust of the earth, produces the fruits of the earth. And so there's a kind of a creative productivity also to Am Yisrael. So it's not all just about you'll have numerous children. It's much more descriptive than that. But I think the point is still that, how does Avraham make an agreement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that isn't just sort of saying, I'll give you whatever you want as long as you promise me that I'll have 1 billion descendants. If it's not going to be that, then what is it going to be? And I think that what Brit Milah becomes is this way of saying, this is how I take my human condition, that I'm male, and I do something different that makes it so that I'm not just being dominated by the sort of warlord rapist genetic history that I must have, and becoming a continuation of that. Because what you do is you take the reproductive male organ and you cut it back. You do something that seems almost like doing violence to it, that you naively might think would somehow hurt your chances of reproducing or come very close to completely cutting off the chance of reproducing. And you do that as a sign to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where you're saying, this is about my relationship with Hashem, and my willingness to take that sort of biological inheritance of the human male from all the generations that came before, of Genghis Khans and everyone else, of Abimelech, of Paro, of Shem, that came before, and say, I will dedicate myself to Hashem in a way that cuts back or reduces or prevents or inhibits that aspect of my biology and my masculinity, and however you want to put it. And the point is, that turns out to be another way to succeed. And it's not by becoming the most numerous, but it is, as it turns out, about becoming the most durable. right? That there are different ways of being a fit member of an ecosystem, so to speak. There's um, a way of being fit that says, like, you make more copies of yourself and you come to dominate it and you take over. But really, anyone who's doing that, that can't go on forever. And there always are things that kind of shut down processes of exponential growth. And you end up not being on top forever. But then there's persisting, there's being a part of the story forever, right? That no matter what happens, you somehow manage to stick around in some form and in some capacity. And that kind of relationship with the world and with Hashem is not one that's about always having the most children at any given instant, or always having the most power, always having the biggest harem. Instead, it's about having a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that preserves something that really can be propagated. Because I think the other thing that's hiding in the background here is that at the end of the day, warlords don't propagate themselves. Some of the genes of warlords propagate themselves. Like, it's a sort of selfish gene idea that really, if you're just talking about the level at which Darwinian selection is happening, when you're talking about something as simple as being male and trying to accumulate a massive harem so that you can produce many offspring, there isn't very much that's left of you that makes it through along with those traits, right? That there's something quite generic about it. There might have been many things about Genghis Khan that were important to him about who he was, but it isn't actually the case that when it all comes out in the wash, that there's much left of Genghis Khan 1,000 or 10,000 years later, other than his hunger for a large harem, right? Because everything else is also competing and washing out, and the only thing that remains is that kind of drive to propagate. And in the case of Avram, instead, I think the point is to say the Brit Milah is about a commitment to Hashem that doesn't make you the most numerous and doesn't make you the most physically powerful or sexually prolific or whatever else. It doesn't make you the least, but in any case, it's not about global dominance in that regard. Instead, it's about having an extremely content-rich identity that it is possible to propagate and preserve forever, right? So that there is something very substantive about who Avram was, who Yitzchak was, who Yaakov was, that is still present in all of their descendants in Am Yisrael, right? That there's some kind of rich, multi-dimensional thing about their personalities and the Imahot as well, that we can understand is reflected in the nation that they've given rise to. So that at a much more substantive level, they really have propagated themselves and made themselves more numerous in a way that Genghis Khan really ultimately didn't succeed at, or Genghis Khan's caveman ancestor didn't succeed at, because the monochromaticity, or the single dimensionality of that kind of male drive to propagate oneself is nothing memorable or remarkable at the end of the day. But the ways in which there are people living today that find themselves living like Yaakov lived, or like Moshe lived, or like David Abimelech lived, in ways that you really can point to and you really can make a substantive analysis of, that is the kind of persistence and the kind of durability and the kind of fruitfulness that Avram is being promised. So I think that this comes out kind of intricately and bouncing back and forth between these different passages. But just to summarize, there clearly is this theme of powerful men taking what women they want for themselves, and that leading to great wickedness, but also at the same time being an unavoidable theme of the human condition because of how powerful the sort of genetic engine for propagation of that is. down through the generations. And you see that with Dinah, you see that with Sarah and Avram. But that Brit Milah is woven against that in the story of Dinah and also in the story of Avram. Where in the story of Dinah, we're seeing how, and it's like, how does Yaakov and his family achieve victory over Shem, the warlord rapist? It's through Brit Milah. And maybe Yaakov was critical of Shimon and Levi for the way they do it, but narratively, at the end of the day, Brit Milah is the demise of Shechem, right? Shechem becomes ultimately a holding of Yaakov because of the power of Brit Milah to undercut the sort of virile violence of Shechem. And Avram, you might say, ultimately merits to have Yitzchak because he realizes that in order to not be like Abimelech, in order not to be someone who kidnaps people's wives to have more children, that he needs to understand something about what is a different way of being, where I'm not trying to propagate my seed in that way. And then he makes a sign for himself of that to Hashem, and then maybe that turns out to actually make it biologically possible finally for him to impregnate Sarah. I know that he was able to succeed with Hagar, but that doesn't mean there wasn't some kind of impediment that was removed by Brit Milah in the case of Avram and Sarah. And that, I think, is, returning to the original point, a reason why we can understand that there's a special simcha in the mitzvah of Brit Milah, and it's not because one sees fundamentally greater value in having sons than daughters, but it's because Brit Milah is a reminder of the fundamentals of the human condition and the greater danger to which daughters are subject. And it takes that joy, actually, of the easier joy of having a son, where you're less worried about how vulnerable he is and how much you'll have to do to protect him. And it says, okay, so you're going to be happy about having a son, so let it be that you're happy about having a son while subjecting him to a little extra danger in order to make sure that you don't rejoice in the world being one in which violence and rape and things like that are easier for men to perpetrate than to be victims of. And so you refuse to partake of that sort of better deal by having a male child, and instead say, no, I'm going to have my brit with Hashem. I'm going to hold back that instinct. I'm going to rein it in. I'm going to say that there's an improvement to be made on the male human being as created, as a sign to Hashem that we understand about the world, that there are things that he made in the world that need fixing, and probably therefore males need a little more fixing than women in that regard. And that by making that sign to Hashem and making a nation that's committed to that kind of fixing the created world and making it better in partnership with Hashem, that ultimately there's a kind of national immortality that flows from that, which is not from Darwinian superiority, but is rather from the richness of the content of our relationship with Hashem that we can pass from one generation to another forever.